Our next visit in Lucknow was to the British Governor-General's residence. In the 1850s there had been a lot of unrest amongst the sepoys. These were the Indian soldiers employed by the East India Company. They felt they were being badly treated and that their traditions were being disrespected. There seemed to be a lot of favouritism regarding promotions. The caste system was involved, religion was involved, and there were a lot of minor insurrections across the whole of North India. It was a sort of boiling pot just waiting for the lid to blow off. The East India Company were well aware of this, and they had begun to prepare for it, and in the residence they'd been stockpiling food and gunpowder and armaments. All it needed was a trigger to set the whole thing off. And in 1857 it was the introduction of the Lee Enfield rifle. It came with cartridges, paper cartridges, which you had to bite the end off. They contained powder, and you tipped the powder into the muzzle of the gun, packed it in, put your ball in, and it was ready for firing. But rumour had it, rightly or wrongly, that the wax on the paper was in fact a mixture of pork and beef fat, which are definite no-nos for Muslims and Hindus. And soldiers began to refuse to use these. It all started with one chap who refused to do it, and an Indian officer was sent to arrest him, and he refused to go. So a British officer was sent, and this Indian sepoy shot him and then tried to kill himself, but wasn't successful. So he was dragged off, court-martialed and hanged, as was the Indian officer who had been sent to arrest him and refused. He too was hanged. And in the town there were about 90 other sepoys who had also refused to use these cartridges. They were arrested, court-martialed and sent to jail for 10 years. The other sepoys thought this was extremely harsh and decided that they were going to release them. Anyway, the upshot was there was an uprising, and British officers were shot, and the whole thing boiled up into mayhem. All the British residents in Lucknow, women, children, officers, soldiers and supporters, they all fled to the Governor-General's residence and got holed up in there. In Kanpur, another town not very far away, the British residents, having been surrounded, decided that they would surrender, and they were offered free passage out. Anyway, there was some confusion depending on which point of view you take, and they were slaughtered, women, children and others, and to hide the evidence they were all tipped into a well. The Governor-General's residence in Lucknow was surrounded by tall buildings, which the aggrieved sepoys occupied. and you could see right down into the residence from these buildings, and they were letting it fly with cannon, and there were snipers in the building shooting anyone who moved. Explosives were placed up against the walls and the gates, and great holes appeared which had to be defended. In the heat, there was terrible illness. Lots of people died from dehydration and disease. In the graveyard there are 2,000 graves of people who died in this siege. Eventually a column under a chap called Campbell managed to get through to the residence and relieve it. Word got out about Cawnpore and other atrocities, and the soldiers of the East India Company set about reprisals with what can only be described as gusto, and very, very few of the sepoys involved in the uprising survived. The British call it the Indian Mutiny, whereas the Indians call it the First War of Independence. The British government was seemingly dismayed by this whole episode, and the East India Company, who had been ruling India by proxy on behalf of the British government, it was disbanded, and the British government ruled direct. Now, the Residency, following the uprising and the relief of the siege, was abandoned, and it's been preserved more or less in the state in which it was abandoned. It's a big place. It's much bigger than I thought it was going to be, and a fascinating place to go on, and of course very important in the history of India. Well, this is where we are this morning in Lucknow, the British Residency. During the Indian uprising in 1857, the British colony in here was surrounded and decimated before they could be relieved. Lots of women and children were killed here, and there's lots of evidence of it still. It covers 26 acres, and there were shops in there, and there was a church and all sorts of other bits and pieces, but they, during the 1857 uprising, a sizable number of them were destroyed. You can read a lot more about it on the internet. So this is our first view of inside the compound boundary. Terrible things happened here. This is the main gate into the place. All sorts of bits you can see where shell, whether it's shell damage or what, I have no idea. So just to outline what happened here, India was ruled by the East India Company, a private army and all sorts of things. And of course it was a profit-making organisation, so they all they wanted was tax. So the farmers were made to grow more and more indigo, and they were growing opium, and they got a little bit brassed off with it. And similarly, the soldiers, the Indian soldiers, the sepoys, whenever it came to battles, and God knows there was a lot of them, they were stuck in the front line, and they took the major brunt of the opposition. And the final straw was to do with the Lee Enfield rifle and the cartridges which contained the powder. You had to pull the top off the cartridge with your teeth and pour the powder down the muzzle of your rifle and pack it in before you put the ball in. And a rumour got round that the cartridge cap was coated with pig fat, which of course is a no-no for Hindus. And they saw that as a real insult. But eventually one of these sepoys pulled the cap off his cartridge, poured it down the bottle, rammed a plug and a ball in and turned around and shot his British officer. That started the whole thing off. And there were revolutions all over the place. There was this huge uprising. Not just here in Lucknow at the Residency, which became quite famous, but all over every residency, every ambassador's residency in every sort of Mughal empire. Here at Lucknow, all the British residents were brought in here, women and children, and the siege started, which lasted about 6 months. It was very difficult to relieve the Residency because all other residencies were under attack, and so the British Army was involved, or the East India Company Army was involved in defending them all. So it took 6 months before they could get here to relieve this Residency. In May and June the temperatures up in the 40s, high 40s. Limited water supply, limited food, being shelled on from both sides from cannon. Only 1,000 of them survived, so lots and lots of women and children died here. But of course, after that began the Raj in a major way, and there was a major roundup of all the culprits, and they were dealt a pretty severe blow. But there were some sepoys who remained very loyal to the British Queen Victoria. So essentially the British had been screwing the Indians, buying our produce at rock bottom prices and then flogging it back to them much more expensively. So if I stand here in the middle of this compound and scan around, you can see there are lots and lots of buildings. It's not just a single. This was the banqueting hall. This one in front of me here. There are lots and lots of them. That was Dr. Frere's house. That's one hell of a house for a doctor. And across there was obviously a church. The whole place was given an absolute pounding. This has obviously been a church, and that's obviously been a mosque. Indeed, it probably still is a mosque. There are many buildings which are just not identified. I don't know what these are. But they're protected with a sort of cap, or they have been protected with a cap of cement to stop them disintegrating any further. They're made from these amazingly small bricks. More tiles than bricks. Following the 1857 mutiny, the whole place was never rebuilt, it was just left. But the mosque has obviously been refurbished inside, although outside it remains exactly the same. But following the relief at Lucknow, there was wholesale retribution, of a brutal sort for the Indians who took part in it. Well, this is the banqueting hall with a couple of great cannons sitting there. Of course, as the siege went on, obviously powder and ammunition became a valuable resource not to be squandered whilst they waited for this relief. They were relieved once apparently, and then after the relief force left, the whole thing started again. And I think there were 3 attempts before it finally all ended. And this is a memorial to Henry Lawrence. I think it was Sir Henry Lawrence, I could be wrong, who obviously didn't survive. And this is the main building of the Residency. And if you look at the walls up there, you can see it's been absolutely pounded by shells. It must have been a terrifying ordeal. As it was, most of the deaths weren't caused by gunfire or shelling, but most of the deaths were caused by illness. Polluted water, lack of food, being all jammed in here together, defecated and urinating where you stood, terrified. It was all of that for 6 months was pretty horrific. And of course, no modern medicines in those days either. But if you look at the history of it, you could see that the Indians were pushed beyond their limit of endurance, and the British had it. Well, certainly the East India Company, they had it coming. It's quite interesting because when you go around the big houses of England, without naming any of them, they were built on wealth taken from the colonies, India, and the slave trade in the West Indies, being just 2 of them. So when we go and look around these grand houses of the aristocracy, that wealth was made on the back of some appalling things which the British did. I mean, it wasn't all bad. You know, we brought the railways and the rule of law and things like that to these colonies, but we screwed them for what we could get out of them in exchange for that. This is the main tower, which of course would be a natural target for guns and shells, and you can see there it's absolutely plastered. It was non-stop. You couldn't go out during the day. There's barbaric snipers up trees, shells being lobbed into the garden. State of that. And this is all from 1857. It now being 2016. It's a little bit overcast today, so there's no sharp shadows. It's a little bit flat, but no, you just have to take what you can get. And this is one of the memorials to the British officers. You don't get memorials to the run-of-the-mill British infantrymen. This is Major General Sir John Inglis. This is self-explanatory. Lieutenants, captains, colonels, surgeons, ensigns, and then right at the very bottom you've got this little note here, Also to the memory of 271 non-commissioned officers and privates of the regiment. So this is just a very brief look around the churchyard. And this was the church, what remains of it. This is inside the banqueting hall. Remains of a nice fireplace up there. Some nice pillars. And some nice ornate brickwork. But nothing much else.